let me just very briefly introduce Gerda once again to everyone here. Gerda has been the director of the Center for European Integration Research since 2012, so since 10 years now. And she has been a professor for political science at the Faculty of Social Sciences in the Department of Government of the University of Vienna since 1998. She's one of the most distinguished, best known and really popular experts when it comes to European policy and democracy, in particular in connection with digitalization, but not only in connection with digitalization. And I'm very much looking forward to learning once again from her today. Because me being a lawyer, I'm the one who then needs to work with the outcome of what is coming from the European Union, and there's quite a lot coming from the European Union in our domain here, as you know. That has been a trend for quite some time now, that the European Commission and then the European Union have been extremely active in steering the digital environment. And the acting von der Leyen Commission is perhaps even more active than those before. We have a tremendous amount of legal acts coming and being under negotiation or already finalized. Just to mention some of them: the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, the European Health Data Space Act, and so on. So there's about a dozen of those, and each of them stands for several thousands of words of legal text, of complex legal text. And all of them stand for an attempt to better structure and better steer and to better govern what is happening here in Europe. And Gerda, different from me, works more in the interesting part of this, which is how these things develop and how they become law. I'm the one who then, as I said, needs to interpret those things and needs to live with them and needs to teach other people to learn to live with them.
Thank you very much, Nikolaus, for the extremely kind introduction. And I hope that at least some parts of my presentation can be of real interest to you. For sure, it would be great if one could present a kind of political science overview to all of the exciting projects Nikolaus Forgo has now already mentioned. But as you can truly imagine, that's close to impossible. I'm still pondering a book project in this area, but clearly this is a longer run project. The policy needs to develop further, but then also this takes a lot of time. What I want to do is first present to you from a kind of macro dimension the EU's digital policies or digitalization policy, whatever we call it. And in a second part, I would like to integrate this perspective in the much broader view of the digital revolution and what it could possibly mean for democracy, depending on how politicians shape it. So that's the two basic parts of my presentation today. Let me begin by highlighting what Nikolaus also just indicated, that actually by now the EU's activities in the field of digitalization are a tremendous lot. And that was not clear from the outset. And even a couple of years ago, it seemed that the EU was, except for some areas, maybe rather slow in coming, whereas the developments were really, really big and forceful. But that has actually somewhat changed in the 2 years, in the past 2 years, I would say 2 or 3 years. Now, historically, what you see is in EU digitalization policy that it is a rather long-standing area if we use a broad definition, because that would already include what has been done in the field of telecommunication policy, and that stretches back for decades. So one stronghold was to regulate the national telecommunications giants, as it were then, and to liberalize the EU's internal market in that area. At a later point, I would like to highlight a second area, and that was data privacy, where already in the 90s there was an important directive trying to safeguard what data goes also outside the European Union. And you will, most of you certainly have heard about the Safe Harbor Agreement and the Privacy Shield, all very controversial and difficult follow-up steps. And actually, this is a field where these days we have new developments with the United States now also acting, and still lots of interaction between the European Union, including the courts, certainly in that area, yeah, and the outside world. But that's just to mention how far back actually that policy stretches if we use a rather broad definition. When we think more specifically about the platform economy and how it has developed in the past 20, 25 years, one might think that disregarding now the few areas of data protection where lots happened also earlier, that maybe the EU wasn't so fast, or there were certainly many who would have liked to see the EU act decisively also a little bit earlier. But in any case, there were breathtaking, certainly, possibly path-breaking developments at the latest with the General Data Protection Regulation of 2016. You will have heard that the global impression this has made was a very big one. And there is Anu Bradford, a US legal scholar, who has, with her book, The Brussels Effect, caught a lot of attention and has pointed out with a very catchy notion that what the EU is doing in the field of digitalization policy at large can have much wider effects elsewhere. And hopes were very high with the GDPR. And as you will have lived through, I believe we are all, certainly all old enough to have seen that certainly it had a strong effect on enterprises and entities in the European Union, including universities. I mean, we all had a lot of work to clean up our lists for distributing information, for example, about public lectures. So even down to very small scale organizers, there were effects. We will only see in the longer run if the effects on the truly large and important actors are as big. And I would like to point out that probably the practical implementation, where it really matters, is a kind of Achilles heel. And it has certainly been discussed controversially that the national data protection authorities who need to come in and act, most in countries like Ireland, where most of the international enterprises have taken their seat, and these units are necessary for a good implementation of the GDPR and other rules. But there is an extreme lack of resources for most of these entities. And that accounts for slowness and sometimes certainly also sloppiness in the implementation of the relevant rules. But now I come to the main point of my first section. By 2022, we have indeed a very large number of ongoing projects. And at the Center for European Integration Research here at the University of Vienna, the Institute for Political Science, I work in this field with a small team. And one of our activities is to keep a list. To keep a list as a kind of guide to this maze of all the initiatives that are being discussed and the stages they go through. And I can tell you that it's not an easy task for the pre-doctoral fellow who is mostly in charge of that, because it simply is so much. These days, when you open specialized news services like Agence Europe, for example, you have so many articles, and you have to watch out that you actually keep a kind of map in your head. Now, I can't offer you a real guide to the maze, but at least I have assembled what I consider the most important ongoing projects at this point. Please mark in the first line of my slide, that is still a selection. There is so many more activities, particularly in the field of co-funding, of action programs, of competence building. And I don't want to belittle these initiatives, but I highlight here mostly the legislative initiatives that actually plan to set real standards that can be enforced. So I start again out with data here. We have ongoing the Data Governance Act, even decided the Data Governance Act regulation in this year. And we have the Data Act, which aims to foster business and business to government data sharing. And that's not all in the field of data, but that's what I want to highlight here in order to not make the list all too long. We have an entire single market strategy, and actually it's huge lists of activities ongoing there. I just want to mention cloud computing, e-commerce, startup promotion, net neutrality. The copyright directive is also very famous by now, decided in 2019. There is also a directive for TV and radio broadcasters regarding copyright. And that's just the peak of the iceberg under the name of the Digital Single Market Strategy. We have an entire area of digital finance, and I'm very happy that a postdoc is working with me who is focusing on that. Also lots of interesting and important stuff, partly very technical as in other areas. Technical also from a functional perspective, not only from the legal one, as Nikolaus Forger already rightly stressed. I mean, these projects are all tremendously complex in legal terms, certainly. Yeah, the digital wallet about to be adopted, talk about cryptocurrencies regulation, blockchain, artificial intelligence. The proposed high-risk AI regulation is one core issue we should be aware of. Also, an AI liability directive has been discussed and is still to be announced as a proposal. There is the CHIPS Act debated. There is the area of standardization. For example, for common charger standards were adopted in 2022. And then there is a huge field, competition policy and information and communication technologies. This is where the big mergers are being discussed and where the competition fines are being made, so to say, and sometimes also upheld vis-a-vis the ECJ. You read about this in the newspapers, and it's certainly also an important aspect of EU digitalization policy. Less fully developed is the taxation side of things. You know, there were directives proposed, but then they were kind of referred to the OECD, and we need to wait and see what's going to result from all this. Second and last side of my overview for you. I come to the regulation of internet giants. Now being discussed at this point are the Platform Workers Directive, to bring labor law, working conditions into the 21st century, I would say. Then we have the Political Advertising Directive. We have efforts or debates in the direction of content control. Most far developed is on terrorist content from 21. Just being discussed is child pornography, not yet being proposed by the European Commission. Then we have a proposal from 2016 to amend earlier law, audiovisual media services. And now come the Digital Markets Act, already adopted, and the Digital Services Act, also to be finalized in 2022. I will come back to this one to talk a little bit more about one of the legislative projects that are extremely up to date. I come towards the end of my list: cybersecurity, cyber defense, privacy, e-government, and digital skills. So these are now, so to say, the core areas of EU digitalization policy and the most important areas by 2022. That is a lot. And I'm not going to continue with lists like that, I promise to you. Rather, I will come to a very to be debated element that needs to be combined with this, because the big question is now, what do we make of it? What can we say about EU digitalization policy besides the fact that it seems to be growing very much at this point, and many topics are at least being debated, if not with standards that come out of the debates. But the big question is, what can be justifiable evaluation criteria for the EU's digitalization policy? And at this point, I would like you to reflect for a minute on your pre-existing opinion in that field. What is your impression of it? How would you qualify the EU's digitalization policy? Be so kind to pin it down, maybe on a sheet of paper. And secondly, think about which yardstick did you actually use when giving that judgment? What is your yardstick? And I will come back and ask you, because I'm going to offer you a number of options for yardsticks and evaluative criteria now. And in the end, I want to see if maybe you had better ideas or differing ideas, or to see about weighing of the various criteria. From my side, as a political scientist, I have to tell you that these issues are truly, truly tricky. Because if you do a research project where you want to evaluate a policy of some political unit, you have to think about all of the dimensions I'm going to talk about now and find good criteria and also quantifiable criteria, or at least criteria you can put categories to. And that is by far not trivial. Let's start with the number of measures. That is sort of what I intuitively came to, and also Nikolaus Forgo, when giving an overview. Yeah, because it's striking our eyes that actually, yes, a lot is ongoing. That is true. However, the number of measures isn't really good enough, because as we all know, a directive or a regulation or a national law, they can actually be numerous but extremely shallow. And what do we make of a policy area that is rich in breadth but poor in depth? We have to weigh one against the other, or maybe only weigh the second one. Then let's think about Anu Bradford's book and the Brussels effect. Shouldn't we include in our evaluation also the external effect beyond the European Union? And in the first step, looking at the European Union, what actually, let me first go to another thing, and that's the legal ambition. I already mentioned ambition in letters is one thing, but what is really implemented then is another. So we have now already 4 or 5 different levels or options, yeah, of evaluating. And now let me come to justifiable comparators, because usually when we evaluate something, we immediately compare it to something else. We could compare the ambition of the European Union with the ambition of the US. But really the US or states in the US, as we know, California may have stricter rules than Delaware, for example, or further ones. And then the member states. Are the member states the best level to compare? Like if the EU adopts, say, the Digital Services Act, should we now look into the member states and what pre-existed? And then what would be the best comparator, the strictest member state or the most liberal or inactive member state? Or maybe it's not even the member states, maybe it's states within member states. Yeah, you see, it gets really, really complex considering the many member states and the many global partners we have. Yeah, I didn't mention as yet global levels like the WTO, for example, or the United Nations organizations where they might have standards that could be compared. But maybe the most important, at least for me as a political scientist, is the last line on my next slide. Here we go. It's theory-guided standards. Because basically, when we compare, we can either just say, oh, empirically, the US might be interesting. Yeah, but what is interesting and why the US? The ideal point of reference is a fully argued body of appreciation, yeah, of reasoned perspective on a policy. Like, for example, many of you will have heard about Shoshana Zuboff's book about surveillance capitalism, which has by some been called a sort of new Marxist capital, not because of Marxism, but because she founds a theory about the digital age that is an extremely critical one. She compares her system and elaborates it, and we could come back to that a little later if you're interested. And if we listen to Shoshana Zuboff, what we clearly hear is that there is a pervasive thing ongoing, because we have big actors collecting data and knowing directly or by connection of these data, knowing stuff about basically all people, or at least many people, many different societies, knowing things we couldn't know. So one of her main focuses is on what she calls the new disbalance of knowledge, so to say. Yeah, and that this is a real danger, and therefore she's against allowing the tracking of users online. She's against targeted advertising, and that's just a few of the warnings, or also what she would ask for a very progressive digitalization policy. Yeah, before I progress, that's the point where I ask you, does anybody want to come in? Has anybody additional evaluative criteria? When you thought about the EU's digitalization policy, what was it you were actually comparing it to? Or is there anything that is not in my list as yet? Would you like to come in and add?
If I may, Gerda, if nobody else is intervening, I mean, one of the factors which I don't find on the list, and I'm asking you why, would be in how far those measures have an impact on the development of the technological environment they are trying to steer. Would you consider this to be an important factor too?
Certainly. I was a bit sloppy, and for me, it is stuck in the implemented, here we go, implemented practice.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's the second line, second last line.
Okay.
Legal ambition in letters or implemented practice. So for me, that includes that the letters are put into practice. But then, no, you're completely right. It should be a fully fledged dimension. Yeah, clearly, what change? How, in other words, from the political science implementation literature, how progressive are the standards? Yeah, and then one can again say how progressive legally and how progressive then in real practice. And now, what you mean is the practiced innovation, so to say, no?
Yes.
Degrees of innovation is also something we sometimes talk about in implementation research. Yeah. Anybody else? I'm pretty sure you're going to ask me in the debate later on about using these criteria and talking about EU digitalization policy. And as a general information, I'm on a kind of project, but that's a multi-annual plan, yeah, to do a book manuscript in this direction. But it's a huge thing. Nonetheless, one of the most important already decided or quasi-decided is the Digital Services Act. So I thought at least I will give you a couple of arguments, what I see as strengths and weaknesses in the Digital Services Act, to give you something with flesh on the bones, so to say, and something about what's really ongoing right now, what has been decided, as you know, informally before the summer, formally and now in autumn, and we will see. Okay, let me come to the strengths first, certainly. Finally, what we see here is new obligations for platforms, yeah, and in particular also major platforms, very large online platforms. I love it in German, flops, and my students love it when when it's called like that. It implies quite the opposite from what they are, because they are very successful, but flop in German means something else. In any case, obligations to be more transparent, to offer audits and appeal possibilities in proceedings, for example, in content moderation. There is a ban on dark patterns. You know, this is when people are incentivized to put their check somewhere and not in the other area, and this is optically presented in a way that immediately everybody would intuitively do it. What is certainly also good is more data access for researchers, as far as it goes, and we will wait to see specifics, but a couple of pros certainly as examples. Now, putting on the lens of Shoshana Zuboff and her surveillance capitalism, there might also be some weaknesses. First one, there is no what is called general monitoring obligation. Sorry, that means that publishers continue not having a responsibility for the content they publish. If you compare that with what goes on the website of a quality newspaper or any newspaper, basically, it's quite different, as we know. And that means something for the political discourse. Talking about political discourse, another important shortcoming is that what Frances Haugen, the whistleblower of Facebook, stresses so much, the engagement-based content ranking, that it should be absolutely forbidden to do that. So as far as I got, and I have to say that's work in progress, so I'm still going through the DSA compromise as it stands, and I'm only going to do it once there is the real final version out. But as far as I see, that has not been forbidden. At least there is now more transparency asked for recommender systems. Yeah, but that's only a very first step, Shoshana Zuboff would say, I expect. And then it's from the outset, illegal content covered. And even then, it's not fully defined what illegal is. That relies on other systems. But in any case, there is lots of problems or ongoing acts, developments being harmful. And it was a big debate in the beginning. Should we include harmful stuff, or should it only be illegal one? And it's the more narrow definition that has ended up with us. Last point to spell out about micro-targeting. It's not prohibited. And it's restricted for vulnerable groups at least, but it's not prohibited. So what I would say is it's certainly a step forward, but I fear if one were to really embark in something that is not surveillance capitalism any longer, that's definitely falling short of this. With my thinking, yeah, from a political science perspective, which may certainly differ from a perspective of for example, people who have been working in informatics for decades and who are so much into the more technical stuff ongoing, that they might see much clearer some potentials this is offering, yeah, in terms of citizen participation, of making everything faster and cheaper in elections. And I see less this technical and maybe also financial, public expenditure perspective. I have more a general, broader political science approach.
Yeah. There was one statement coming now from the students.
Lovely.
It says in the chat that he would say that both visions were present in the classes. So.
Okay, that's already very informative. Thank you. Lovely. I don't see the chat, although I opened it before, but I don't know. Yeah. Okay, thanks for informing me. That's good.
So when you look into it from into the legal debate, obviously both perspectives are present too, right? So there are people like myself who are a little bit more optimistic, and then there are, actually it very much depends on whether I'm optimistic or not, but roughly I'm a little bit more optimistic than many of my colleagues, I would say.
Yeah. Very well, and good for your health. Yeah, that's very good. I must say I'm also I have become a bit more optimistic since I see that at least the EU is now moving. And what is famous in political science, the joint decision trap of the EU, where many projects have in the past been stuck for many, many years or even decades. That this seems, under the high pressure digitalization actually gives on EU politicians. This seems not to be a major issue. The acts get decided, and then we need to discuss the levels that result from that. No, but at least the thing is moving now, and that gives me optimism.
Yeah. But if I may say so, Gerda, I think it very much, if you look into the details, things become very, very complicated very quickly. So for example, in the AI Act, but also in particular in the European Health Data Space Act, which is one piece of legislation that I had a closer look into just recently. It's a lot of text without anything on the technical specifications that would be needed. And I'm rather reluctant whether all those good things that are described in the European Health Data Space Act will ever become reality, because nobody writing those texts has a clue about what the technical implementation of this would need and what it would cost. So this gap between political/legal goal description on the one hand and technical feasibility on the other hand, this is increasing and not decreasing. So this is one of the reasons why I'm not always optimistic. Let's say it like this, right?
I fully agree. Yeah, the CHIPS Act is one thing where also my feeling is that there is a tremendous gap between talk and walking the walk. And by the way, yeah, I'm now coming to my chapter where I want to discuss why it's relevant for democracy, what happens in digitalization. And we have basically two directions here. One is internally in the EU, and democracy developments in the EU matter, and digitalization matters for them. And I will come to that. But the other thing is also, we have dangers for democracy coming from outside in. And here digitalization is a strong weapon, actually, as it turns out. Because the EU is quite late, sloppy, whatever, in cybersecurity issues. And in general, digitalization brings with it a huge reliance on private actors on the one hand, and on digital infrastructures. And all political systems have sort of underestimated or overlooked for a long time the importance of the infrastructure, of the sheer infrastructure of digitalization. Think about cables, undersea cables. And so this brings us to the topic of digital sovereignty, which would be an entire talk on its own. But I just want to state here that the EU has only just started that kind of debate. There is no digital sovereignty, however we interpret this difficult notion. It's very clear that all borders are extremely open, and that's not only for selling infrastructure like ports in Greece or Germany. That's not only for essential infrastructures like in 5G, where it's very late debate that has been ongoing, and at best shallow kinds of policies ongoing. And it's easy to understand why, but nonetheless, it's important to also take this into consideration. Not only because we have now the US elections ongoing, not only because one of the closest to Vladimir Putin has today spoken out about influencing elections in the US, which may be true, but in any case is what is called in political science a perception hack. It may be as bad if people distrust elections than if elections are truly hacked. Okay, so that is an important dimension. And we are only just starting really to discuss that. Or maybe later regulate. It's almost nothing there in regulation. Although we know that autocracies hardly stick to rules when it's about human rights, but also when it's about agreements, and that might at one point concern also digitalization infrastructures. But let me go to the internal side of things. What is it, how digitalization might actually impact here? I see a picture of 4 pillars, and all of these pillars are important for democracy. We have economic issues, we have the media impact on the individuals who vote, and that has an impact on the governments. Governments might then regulate the platform economy, but it very much depends which parties are in government and what's ongoing here. Basically, and that's my point, all central pillars of democracy are somehow concerned by this digital revolution. That is my main point, and I will only very briefly go through that before I come to the end. The first point is that the platform economy increases inequalities tremendously, both between enterprises and between people. And that's negative in terms of democracy, because democracy can only stand so much inequality. So much, I should say, and the processes go like that. Here we come again to Shoshana Zuboff's path-breaking book, which I really, really recommend. And this tilted division of knowledge I've already mentioned before, that is also something that is really, really basic, that a few digital giants have so much information. That's already a problem. But in a second step, they can work with this information, make personalized profiles and group profiles, sell that for advertising or use it themselves for influencing people. But then as a third step, they are developing AI with that. And they have a huge advantage because they own all of this data. And so that's all but trivial. And it will be ever more difficult to counterbalance the longer we wait. I have no time to also speak about the positive effects of digitalization. Yeah, we are all clear that they exist, but I have no time here. But what happens is that there is a distortion of competition since we've waited quite long to countersteer. And we see the democracy's tax base eroded. We also see that the basic infrastructures are now all intermingled with digital technology, and we have a basic insecurity. Because what happens is that the products, the software being sold is usually only in the peak of the iceberg, newly developed. But then there is the big bottom of the iceberg, and there is lots of old code in there, which has partly dangerous gaps. So let's come to the next point, which is the media. Because we know the major platforms are very often connected to the political discourse if they are platforms like, for example, Facebook and Google and the likes. The media are influenced by the platform economy, and quality media of older times, they are having an increasingly a problem now because sort of their market model is fading. And the political discourse has moved from public to private owned spaces, largely. What do the so-called social media? They are very often not social in a narrow sense because they empower extremists. They are the most active participants. They make moderates all but invisible, and they make people inclined to represent themselves in a distorted way. The internet is dominated by fake news, hate speech, and trolls. That's not me, but Philip Howard speaking from Oxford University. And he did one of the most important books in the field called, short but very much to the point, Lie Machines. So Phil and his team found such Trollfabriken, it's called in German, for the first time in Russia in 2017. But by now they exist in almost all countries. And they found it specifically in 70 plus states in 2021. Yeah, and that's about the organized misinformation on social media. Yeah. Can we change that easily? No, we can't, because entrepreneurial goals of the digital platforms are simply antagonistic to reducing post-truth content. Yeah, that's why they are not going to do it out of their free will. It's not going to be easy. And in the near future, they are going to exploit artificial intelligence to attract even more attention and make it more difficult with deepfakes. And we have ever less attention and business for quality information. So what about individuals and governments? And then I come to the end. Individuals. Psychologists discuss that certainly we all love our gadgets and there is huge advantages. But what about well-being, and what about the self and the free will here? Human capacities only stay if they're trained. And the more we expect from technology, the less we might go into real conversation, learn to still focus to talk to one another, or make it a habit. And then it's also discussed that many look for the app first now. And we know that for map reading and stuff like that, pupils nowadays are already much worse. And if we ever stand a day without the technology, it's going to be a big question. And we already had some experiments, and we had some glitches of technology where actually things were happening badly because people were no longer really in a situation to live without the technology. Information overload has a great impact on our intellects and on our souls. And when stressed, we also regress to prejudice, which is also very dangerous, because information overload is certainly something we all suffer from nowadays tremendously. Last, under this section, I come to the free will, and I'm really going to recommend Brett Fishman's work. They argue that when we design programmable worlds, it goes hand in hand with making also the users of the software, more predictable and more programmable, so to say. And they worry about the so-called free will, because choice architectures do actually redefine pathways for people. And what happens then is that people are used to not making an own choice from scratch, but working with menus. And sometimes we are tempted to feel like it's our free will if we choose one of two options. But actually, the thing is, if we can buy a red or a blue sweater, maybe what is much more important is, do we need a new sweater from the start? Or would we actually have liked to buy trousers? And so that's about pathways that are predefined. Now think about the conditions of service agreements we have to sign off every day and always have to say yes to something we don't like. That's a second dimension they discuss in its effects. And the last thing I want to mention is nudge and nudge creep, how they call it. They argue that there are systemic effects beyond the single nudge that is usually studied. So it's a very intense but very, very important book that I really would recommend to you. And important is that we have to think beyond autonomy, or freedom of choice, because there are essential components of a free will, and that's what is the available information, what is the action orientation of somebody in the situation of choosing, what are his or her preferences, opinions, and values. And if these elements are being influenced, there is no free choice, even if we can then tick A or B. That's the essence of their argument. So, last point, governments, as you can imagine, people are voters, and therefore what people perceive in our online world and in this kind of often deranged discourse matters for elections. But on the other side, also politicians adapt to the new styles of online media. And many hold that this goes towards more populist styles, that it might be disuniting, that more radical contents might find more interest on such platforms. There is already a debate that online platforms might actually be a kind of next system of government, or governance in the broader sense, because they take over many state functions, they coalesce with politicians, and that might also lead to one kind of ending of democracy. And now I come to the pessimistic possibility. That's a phasing model. On the left side, we start out with a certain kind of platform economy impacting on the media, impacting on the individuals, and impacting on the governments. Governments elected after that kind of procedure might easily continue to effectively fail to regulate the platform economy. If that were true, we would end up in a phase 2. And now we start again on the right side top. The platform economy stays essentially unregulated, gets ever more monopolistic and unbalanced. The media discourse is overall even more biased towards hate and disinformation. Individuals get even more fearful, shallow thinking, self-oriented, and governments contain even more populist-style politicians neglecting democratic values and human rights, and might fail again to regulate the platform economy. So that is a kind of negative cycle. I do hope very much that we will actually not have to live through such a negative cycle. I hope we can debate and contribute so that the cycle can be turned around and work towards a more regulated digital economy and society. And that's it from my part. I look forward to a discussion with you. Thanks.